This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
I wanted to give a very big welcome to this evening portion of our ROOP conference. It is wonderful to see each of you here tonight, and I'm just delighted to welcome our most honored guest, Mr. Arthur Roop. I don't know if Arthur is here yet. I heard that he might be here tonight. Oh, he was here. Oh, I missed him, but I want to thank him so much. I would like to give very special welcome to our keynote speaker, Jeff Greenfield. It's so nice to see you here again. And we are so pleased that we could see you. Just last time we saw you was 2 years ago to give a series of lectures. And I even had a wonderful lunch with you, along with one of our Nobel laureates wanted to see you. So we had a good conversation. I still remember that. Thank you very much. And let me also say thank you to all of our today's presenters and to our sponsors. Our ROOP conference is sponsored by the Arthur N. Roop Professorship in the Social Effects of Mass Communication, sponsored by the Department of Communication and the Carsey-Wolf Center for Film, Television, and New Media. By the way, we have a wonderful new building for the Carsey-Wolf Center for Film and Television New Media, along with a Pollock Theater, which are 85% completed. If you go to Rob Gym there, you're going to see this wonderful building, which is going to have the grand opening in the summer, probably. I would also like to recognize and thank my colleagues for their roles in today's conference. Our Arthur Roop Chair in the Social Effects and Mass Communication and a co-director of our Carsey-Wolf Center for Film, Television, and New Media, Ron Rice. Had I known that you would... Yeah, I wanted to introduce our Professor of Film and Media Studies, Anna Everett. Anna? Yeah. I want to introduce our Professor of Film and Media and the Director of our Carsey-Wolf Center, Constance Penley. Constance. I would also like to thank our conference committee, the 3 professors of communication. I think you better stand up so people can see you. Michael Stahl, also our chair of the communication department. Linda Putnam. Yeah. Linda, we're still very glad that you could join us. And Dan Lins. Dan? and our Carsey-Wolf Center for Film, Television, and New Media brings together over 50 faculty colleagues from over 20 departments. The research of our distinguished faculty includes such diverse topics as the history of intellectual property, free speech and media outlets, credibility of media sources, state and corporate ownership of satellite technologies, and new media and political communication. As you all know, Santa Barbara is home to many people and groups interested in media. So now I would like to close by saying that we are especially grateful to Arthur Roop for endowing this Roop Professorship in Social Effects of Mass Media. The Roop Foundation is truly a wonderful, wonderful campus partner and a supporter, and also an asset to our society. So we are very pleased that we have all of you to join us tonight for this very special lecture for Jeff Greenfield. Thank you.
like to do is interview the people, introduce the people who will appear after Jeff Greenfield, so that I don't have to disrupt that flow. Our moderator is Anna Everett, who was introduced nicely by Chancellor Yang. She's a professor and a former chair of the Department of Film and Media Studies. She was also the former director, well, she is now currently the former director. She was the director of UC Santa Barbara Center for Black Studies. She's published a lot of very interesting books. One called Returning the Gaze, A Genealogy of Black Film Criticism, 1909 to 1949. New Media, Theories and Practices of Digital Textuality. Afro Geeks, Beyond the Digital Divide. The Afro Geeks conference occurs here from time to time, and she has led that. Learning Race and Ethnicity, Use in Digital Media. She has a brand new book out that she hasn't actually yet physically received, but should appear in her desk any day now, called Digital Diaspora, A Race for Cyberspace. She founded and edits the journal Screening Noir, a journal of film, television, and digital culture. And as I said, she's organized the 2004 and 2005 Afro Geeks conferences, and she will moderate the discussion afterwards. It's the rapture. I'd like to briefly just mention, I won't give the full description, but of the four presenters, the four main presenters, they're going to come up after Mr. Greenfield's presentation and be available to provide questions to Mr. Greenfield. And he was very, very interested in their presentations, and I think there's a lot of continuity between some of the topics he's going to raise, some of the topics they've raised, and a communication between them. So Dana Mastro is she's an associate professor and the director of graduate studies in the Department of Communication at the University of Arizona. She made a very nice presentation on ethnicity and what the polls said about the role in the election. Kristen McCauley is in the Department of Black Studies, and his area of research in Northern and Southern African politics, world systems theory, Black intellectual history, and other areas. And he talked about some of the interesting issues that, I won't use the verb he used, bothered him from the campaign. Lance Bennett, who is the professor of political science and Riddick Lawrence professor of communication at the University of Washington, he made a very nice presentation on arguing for the benefit of humor and political communication, and he's done a lot of work in online communities and in the relationship between online and offline activity that leads to civic engagement. Roderick Hart presented a very nice, as to say, the paradoxical humorous discussion on why humor is not so useful for political communication. And he's the Shivers Chair in Communication and Professor of Government, and also the Director of the Ned Strauss Institute for Civic Participation at the University of Texas at Austin. So we have quite an august audience here, even though it's only March. So let me introduce our guest speaker. We're very, very pleased to have him. He's been here over the years at UCSB, lives part-time in UCSB, in Santa Barbara. We'd love to have him actually living here. He has a law degree from Yale, an honorary degree in laws at Union College. He's currently the senior political correspondent for CBS. He was formerly CNN's senior political analyst, and he's contributed to The Situation Room, American Morning, and Polizan Now. He has a tremendous background that's actually separate from his media professionalism. He was a legislative fellow for the office of Senator Robert Kennedy. He was assistant to New York City Mayor John Lindsay. These are very, very influential people. He's been a political consultant. He's been a lecturer at law schools. He's been a political media analyst for ABC, for CNN. He's a syndicated columnist for Universal Press. He's won 4 Emmys. He's won the Quill Award for Meritorious Journalism. He was an industry fellow here for us for 2 years. And he has a wide variety of books, ranging from The Advance Man in 1971, up through The People's Choice in 1995, and Oh Waiter, One Order of Crow, 2001. I'm sure he was not eating crow for his own mispredictions, but probably for others. He's also been writing magazine and newspaper articles for over 40 years for all the top magazines, Harper's, Esquire, New York Times Magazine, New York Times Book Review, my personal favorite, Chicago Tribune, National Lampoon, which gives you a little clue into his wide-ranging appreciation of language and the world around us. And his presentation, as you can see, is Analysis of Media Coverage. Did it make any difference? Jeff Greenfield.
Hi, don't panic. big type, wide margins. It is really a pleasure to be back here. I taught here 2 years ago. My wife went here a few years before that. The only thing I cannot figure out every time I come here is how, in God's name, does anybody get any work done? You know, when I went to school at the University of Wisconsin, nobody had to persuade us to go inside this time of year. So I'm going to keep coming back till I figure that out. And congratulations to the School of Communication on its 25th anniversary. I should have brought something silver, but I forgot. Thanks also to Michael and to Anna, two people without whom my courses 2 years ago would have collapsed in complete organizational chaos, because that's a weakness of mine. So that said, I hope you, those of you here, fully appreciate the incredibly courageous act I'm about to perform. Because when you talk about the media's role in politics, you are entering a minefield where a whole lot of onlookers have a rooting interest in watching you blow yourself up. And this is especially true if, like me, you believe that some of the core beliefs of those most interested in this subject are either wrong or exaggerated or so filtered through a prism of ideological beliefs or biases that a dispassionate conversation about this subject is almost impossible. And it is especially true if, like me, you believe that more often than not in campaigns, the whole idea of the media exercising a profound, not to say deliberate, impact on the shape of a political race is one of those exaggerated notions. And to tip my hand at the beginning, I will argue tonight that in 2008, which is the pattern in most of our recent presidential campaigns, the media's impact was dwarfed by far more significant forces, and not just the first stage of the economic calamity that dominated the last 6 weeks of the campaign. Nonetheless, with the cautionary reminder from John Kennedy that civility is not a sign of weakness, and with an acknowledgement that I might be wrong about some of this, I want to look back on 2008, point to moments where I think the media's impact was in fact, or were in fact, let's be grammatically correct here, significant. Look at where the endlessly discussed new media did have a really significant impact, but it is not necessarily where you think it did. Raise the subject of media bias, which has been the subject of a C-SPAN panel that has been in continuous session for the last 28 years. And when I suggest that the media's influence are overblown, I will do it as much as I can by pointing to what actually happened in the primaries and general election. I told my class I taught here 2 years ago, I do not come armed with theories, constructs, or narratives. I will tell you what I think happened, and then these nice people or you can tell me where and why I'm wrong, or celebrate the wisdom you have just heard. Your choice. Now look, it is certainly true that the media, old and new, were the focus of almost as much attention in this campaign as the candidates themselves. That charges of bias coming from the left almost as much as the right this time were heard from the opening days of the campaign to the days after it ended. It is also true that this is the year when the web came into full political flower, and I'm going to touch on that with some specificity. But just to take one example, the obsession with polls and their proliferation spread totally into the general population, or at least the general population of those who care about politics. I have come to believe that the American economic meltdown happened in large measure because last fall everybody at a computer, including hedge fund traders, investment bankers, and mortgage securitizers, weren't paying attention to their work. They were clicking back and forth between Real Clear Politics, PoliticsHome.com, and 538.com to find the latest polling from Ohio. I could be wrong about this. It is also clear that in 2008, YouTube became the permanent repository of anything any candidate or supporter had ever said, captured by a whole array of new devices, cell phone cameras or what have you, thus producing material for an endless stream of embarrassments and resignations from campaigns and apologies. This is all true, and there's more. But it is at least instructive to remember the fundamental terrain on which this campaign was fought out. From the beginning, it was the electorate's intense dissatisfaction with the way things were going and its intense hunger for change of a dramatic kind. Back in early 2007, and I would remind you, before the first real hint of economic trouble was in the wind, Some 70% of respondents, in answer to what I regard as a critical benchmark question, how do you think things are going? Things okay, or are they off on the wrong track? 70% or more said the country was seriously off on the wrong track. That's some of the highest negative numbers you will find given the then economic climate. In addition to which, the outgoing president's job approval numbers were under 30%, which at that point you are getting into Jimmy Carter territory or Nixon after Watergate. So I mention this at the outset to suggest, as a thought experiment, that if you knew nothing about what the next year and a half would bring, if you knew nothing about the identity of the candidates, if you knew nothing about the ebb and flow of events, but something about American political history, you might have wagered that a party seeking to retain the White House for a third term, always a difficult endeavor, with an incumbent president with record low approval ratings and a profoundly unhappy electorate, would have trouble keeping the White House. But was this terrain really reflected in the media presentation of the race as it began in early 2007, or actually mid-2007, when the pace began to quicken? The assumptions most in evidence back then were these. On the Republican side, Senator John McCain, his campaign was dead, kaput, finished. Put a fork in it. Campaign finance woes, staff desertions. 5% of Republicans said they would support him, and he was in general in disfavor with the Republican conservative base going all the way back to 2000. So the battle was going to come down to Rudy Giuliani, Fred Thompson, and Mitt Romney. On the Democratic side, Senator Hillary Clinton was the odds-on favorite. Indeed, every year, at the end of the year, there's a big dinner in Washington, a party. I'm not invited, but that's fine. I'm not bitter. And these folks, these ultimate insiders, are polled. And Clinton was a choice of more than 80% she was going to be the nominee. By the way, my recollection is these people are always wrong. The insiders. They're never, ever right, but they're insiders. Now, because the issue of media coverage was so centered on the Democratic primary, because that primary lasted so much longer, the Republican race, contrary to a lot of predictions, was over very quickly by Super Tuesday, in effect. I want to very briefly describe the Republican race with respect to the media, and then move to the Democratic race, and then we'll look at the general election, and then these people will tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. It'll be exciting. One of the most significant media impacts of the Republican race happened actually back in the fall of 2006. And it's a chain of events that owes something to a very classic PBS show from long ago called Connections, hosted by James Burke. This was a show that would go from one event to another over the centuries, showing how one was linked to the other, so that the creation of the Hanseatic League in the 13th century inevitably led to the invention of Saran wrap. It was that kind of thing. It was an intellectual show. So here's my version of that. It's 2006, and Virginia Senator George Allen is waging a re-election campaign, which is the lead-up to his effort to become the Republican nominee as the champion of social conservatism. He is facing Jim Webb, former a novelist of some repute, Vietnam combat veteran. Okay, so the Webb campaign, not that Webb, Webb with two B's, the Jim Webb campaign has a campaign aide that they send around with a little camera to follow George Allen around, hoping to capture him in a moment of weakness. This guy is I would say in the politically correct way, happens to be a South Asian. No, he was a South Asian, and that's critical. So Senator Allen spots him and makes a comment at him and calls him macaca, a phrase that he said was just a nonsense phrase, but by some wild coincidence happens to be a term of racial insult directed at dark-skinned North Africans by Europeans who live in North Africa, which Senator Allen's mother was. Him claiming that this was a kind of fortuitous slip of the tongue would be like me as a Jew saying, Schwarze, is that an insult to black people? Gee, I had no idea. It had a huge impact because this aide captured this moment, threw it up on YouTube, and it played throughout the campaign. One of the things about YouTube is it never dies. It's there forever. A momentary slip, gaffe, whatever you want to call it, is now a permanent thing that any station covering the Webb Allen race goes right back to YouTube and gets it. What happens? George Allen loses that campaign by 0.3% and decides, obviously, not to run for president, meaning there's no obvious social conservative in the race. And at that point, Mitt Romney's advisors say, wait a minute, You're a former pragmatic, pro-choice, pro-gay rights governor of Massachusetts. This ain't going to fly in the Republican Party, and we now have an opening. Now you can run as a born-again social conservative, which not only split that wing of the party, but severely undermined Mitt Romney's credibility and made John McCain a much more attractive candidate. Now, that's a theory. But it's one way of showing you how this new device has consequences that you have to take a step back and look at to see how this resonates. But I think, actually, what really happened in the Republican primary was best described tongue-in-cheek by Rich Lowry, the editor of the National Review, who said the only way to explain how John McCain could have been nominated, the only way, was that McCain got everybody, all the other candidates in a room and liquored them up and then told them what he needed. He said, Governor Romney, I need you to run as a social conservative so that you'll look like an unprincipled flip-flopper and open, okay? Governor Huckabee, I need you to go to Iowa and beat Mitt Romney to undermine his inevitability strategy. Giuliani, I need you to spend $3 million in New Hampshire and then leave so that state is now my playing field to anybody who's not on the hard right. Senator Fred Thompson, I need you to wake up just long enough from your 6-month slumber to go to South Carolina, split the conservative vote so I can win it. And they did. Okay. Now, that probably didn't happen. But it shows you the unlikelihood. The split among his opponents and the fact that unlike every past Republican race, there was no obvious front runner. That's the startling thing about Republicans. They always have the logical next guy. They're an orderly party. They take their turn. The first Bush had to wait for, Reagan had to wait for Ford, Bush had to wait for Reagan, Dole had to wait for Bush. This time there was no obvious candidate, which meant that for the first time since Teddy Roosevelt, who only got to the White House through an assassin's bullet, the Republicans nominated an insurgent. And it also demonstrates that even in the Republican Party, this desire for change, nobody was chanting 4 more years the way they were in 2004. And those were the, to me, the political realities that drove that campaign. That and the fact that the Republicans, unlike Democrats, had winner-take-all primaries. In states like New York and New Jersey and others, you win by 1 vote, you won all the delegates. That was designed for Rudy Giuliani in the Northeast. It wound up cinching McCain's nomination. What I really can't find beside that YouTube incident is any real media impact. Yes, the New Hampshire primary, where McCain came alive, certainly was covered as McCain's comeback, but that wasn't a media narrative. That was the reality. McCain had won that state in 2000 by 19 points. Independents and Democrats could vote in that primary. It was the place where he had to win or die, and he won and survived. So with that in mind, let me turn to the Democrats. And I'm going to take a first bite at this issue of media bias. It had a real interesting flavor last year because, first of all, it surfaced in the Democratic primary, and for the last 4 decades, by and large, it's been an article of faith among conservatives and Republicans that the media are biased in favor of liberals and Democrats. And it is certainly true that the overwhelming majority of reporters vote Democratic. There is no point to denying that. It is true. You can argue about what it means. But this time it was centered in the Democratic primary, and it involved issues of race and gender, which generate heat, if not always light. I mean, these are very emotional matters. So if you look at strictly through the prism of media coverage, Hillary Clinton went through the whole first 8 or 9 months of 2007, assuming, as I said, as the overwhelming favorite. In fact, I was dispatched by my executive producer in the fall of 2007 to do a piece on why nobody had laid a glove on Hillary Clinton. And I decided to interview Mike Murphy, a prominent Republican strategist. You see him a lot on Meet the Press, one of the smartest people around. And I put the question to him, and he said, well, that's okay, but you should know I don't think she's going to be the nominee. And shrewdly I asked, why not? Those of you looking for a career in journalism, keep notes. Somebody says something surprising, try to follow up. And I said, well, why do you think that? He said, because this is a change election, and Senator Clinton can't be the change candidate. Now, if you remember what I started out with, the fundamental terrain of this campaign, that intense desire to change, I think you have a hint of where I'm going. So we had incidents. Clinton muffed a question about driver's licenses for illegal aliens. It became a big kerfuffle in the press, and some of her supporters said, you see, Obama muffed that same question, and she got all the heat. That shows you that the media is in the tank. The second thing that happened was the coverage of the Obama phenomenon. I mean, here was this freshman senator, a guy who he himself described in his convention speech that brought him to national attention, a skinny black kid with a funny name, with no experience of the kind that most presidents have demonstrated as candidates, generated enormous crowds, enormous enthusiasm, enormous amount of money, which is a key I'll get to later. And it drew, and the coverage of that enthusiasm reflected that drive. This was the source of Chris Matthews' endlessly mocked comment that when I hear Obama speak, a thrill runs up my leg. Or maybe it's down his leg. It was the reason why NBC's Lee Cowan said, you know, when you cover an Obama event, it's hard to stay objective. And the coverage of Obama as the exciting new guy on the block, with race clearly although I do not think the only reason, led to the conclusion that, on the part of many, that the press was in the tank for Obama. The apotheosis of this was a Saturday Night Live sketch, you may remember, where in the middle of a debate they ask him, the moderators, and they ask him, are you comfortable? Can we get you a pillow? A sketch that Hillary Clinton herself referenced in a subsequent debate. And it's not only that fervor, but the movement of that campaign, as Obama began to demonstrate his chops, resulted in a fair number of Clinton supporters arguing that the press was holding her to a harsher standard because, in part, she was a woman. It was a very much noted New York Times op-ed piece where Gloria Steinem, the iconic first-generation feminist, said it would have been unimaginable for a woman with Obama's credentials to emerge as a serious candidate. Geraldine Ferraro, first woman VP candidate, argued if he were white, he never would have been given that kind of run. Clinton campaign talked a lot about the old boys network, who didn't want a woman in their clubhouse. Now, I took a plunge into this controversy because the anchor of the show that I appear on is Katie Couric, first woman to solo anchor a newscast and who had felt the sting of what she saw as gender-based criticism when she took the job. And I called people who had made this assertion, and I did the best job I can, and I found myself completely unable to disentangle what part of the coverage was based on the fact that Hillary Clinton was a woman, and what part was based on the fact that she was this woman, a woman who had come to prominence as First Lady because she'd married the guy who became the boss. And maybe more important, she represented to a lot of people a return to the Clinton years. Now again, if the fundamental terrain of the campaign was change, a return to the Clinton years wasn't what people, even Democrats, necessarily wanted. Obama knew that full well. I mean, his whole campaign rhetoric was we have to turn the page. We have to go beyond the arguments of the 90s. And that was a slap at the Clinton folks as well as Bush and Bush Sr. and Jr. That's what Michael Murphy was getting at when he said that that Clinton couldn't be a change candidate. It's what the Clinton campaign could never figure out. They knew, they're not dumb. They understood this. Her first slogan was ready for change, ready to lead. But it was impossible to convince voters that Clinton, particularly as Bill Clinton began to take a more dominant role in that campaign, was changed. The Clinton campaign believed, you guys are crazy. Of course she's changed. She'd be the first woman president. How can that not be changed? Well, if your name is Clinton, that's how. And it also opened the door for Clinton, for Obama, to make the argument, look what experience got us. Especially in a Democratic primary where every plausible candidate except Obama had been for the Iraq War. So it was what I called in a widely unread book many years ago, political judo, where you take your weakness and your opponent's strength and you flip it. You want experience? You want the people who brought you the Iraq War? You want the people who brought you all that partisan bickering? I'm different. And in that sense, everything about Obama that should have been a negative, the thin resume, thinnest resume since Grover Cleveland, for those of you keeping score, the fact that he was an oddly named guy, the fact that he was black, the fact, as he said in a wonderful speech, you know, he said, my middle name was given to me by somebody who obviously never thought I'd ever run for president. And yet for a lot of people, young folks most especially, as you'll see, that very distance from the conventional political model was an asset. Now, two other points I want to make about this gender thing and Clinton, and then we'll move on to the general. Well, maybe 2.5 points. The first was that when I would ask people about this, they always came back with the same 3 or 4 examples. Tucker Carlson on MSNBC saying, when I see Senator Clinton, I want to cross my legs. You know, that's a problem between him and a therapist. Or Chris Matthews' comment. Or the 3 dopes, I shouldn't say, I think they were college kids who went to a Clinton event and held up a sign saying, iron my shirt. Now, these are all worthy of critique. They do not represent media coverage of Clinton. All right? And a lot of times the evidence, the Clinton campaign made a tape proving media, but it was the same examples over and over. But look back to New Hampshire. Here's another example where I think the media really did have an impact. Old media, the one I work in. The night before the New Hampshire primary, when every poll, including Clinton, showed Obama with a double-digit lead, Clinton had appeared at a diner, one of those, sit down and talk with ordinary people. And a woman asked her, how do you do it? Just meaning, how do you get up every day and do it? And somehow that question got to her. And you may remember this, those of you who still watch television. She welled up. She couldn't talk for a few minutes. She was trying to talk about how much she felt about the issues. Every network, cable and broadcast, ran uninterrupted, enormous by television standards, time. Our air was 4 minutes of Clinton just unmediated. This is the night before the primary. It is the last thing that voters saw. And by the way, nobody was polling late into the night. When you want to know how could that have happened, how could everybody have been so fooled, I think, again, I can't prove this, but my strong sense is that last image, speaking to a Democratic electorate that basically, like both these people, tilted the balance. Okay. But what happened after the New Hampshire primary was even more instructive when you come to the question of media bias. There followed, now remember, Clinton wins. Obama's knocked on his heels. Suddenly the favorite who lost in Iowa may look like kind of second life. There were this spate of endorsements of Obama, all coming from credentialed Democratic women. Claire McCaskill, senator from Missouri, Jean Carnahan, former senator from Missouri, Kathleen Sebelius, governor of Kansas, Janet Napolitano, governor of Arizona, Caroline Kennedy. Now, there are different reasons for these endorsements, but it's hard to see these folks as embracing an anti-feminist movement. They were part of the parade of endorsements, in my view, that reflected the need, the hunger for change, and in part feeling that a lot of Democrats who felt that, the Clinton years were great for the Clintons, but not so hot for the Democratic Party. Now, the second point, okay, Super Tuesday happens, it's a draw. Obama goes on to win 11 straight primaries. She's out of money. He's like Scrooge McDuck. It's fallen out of the ceilings. The press, a lot of the press is saying, all right, come on, Hillary, get out. And what happens? She starts winning primaries. She wins Pennsylvania, she wins Ohio, she wins Texas, she wins West Virginia, she wins the bulk of the later primaries. In other words, horrible to think about, the voters weren't paying all that much attention to what the press was demanding, which is a point I think that needs constant underlining. We aren't as powerful as we think we are, thank God, and we're not as powerful as our critics think we are. Which is a segue into my last point about the primaries. Look, it's frustrating to me that some of my colleagues don't ever bother to just look at the numbers. They're right there, they're free, you can get them easily. This race was a tie. Each of them got roughly 18 million votes, depending on whether you count half of Florida, 2/3 of Michigan. It's a tie. The split among delegates, pledged delegates, was 100 delegates out of, I think, 3,000 plus. What happened in the primaries, and it does have a media point, was that the Obama campaign understood the mechanics and the rules of the contest, and Hillary Clinton's campaign did not. Okay? Now, why? The Clinton campaign assumed that 2008 was going to be like the last 25 years, over early, by Super Tuesday at the latest, all done, finished, wrapped up. Terry McAuliffe, the chair of the Clinton campaign, at a gathering in early '07, my wife remembers this, said, he's a cheerleader kind of guy. He says, over by Super Tuesday, done, guaranteed, take it to the bank. Now, what they forgot What the Obama campaign knew was that under the rules of the Democratic Party, you don't win that many more delegates than the loser if you win a primary. You've got to win by like 2/3. The Democrats treat their delegates like a cake at a kid's birthday party, where every slice has to be as even as possible. So that in most places, for instance, if you're running a congressional district here in California and there are 4 delegates and you get 60% of the vote and your opponent gets 40, you each get 2 delegates. Which is why you can win a primary by a lot and not get that many delegates. What the Obama campaign understood was if you go to a caucus state and kick butt, get in there with an organization and catch the Clinton campaign asleep and win big, you will actually do better than by winning a big state by this much. Here's, for me, the essence of that campaign. Obama got more delegates by winning the Kansas and Idaho caucuses than Clinton got winning the Pennsylvania and Ohio primaries, because he won by so much. Now, why is this a point about the media? Because it spotlights what was really the importance of the new media, or to be more precise, new ways of sharing and spreading information. Yeah, the web was a big deal in this campaign. The internet overtook newspapers as the second biggest source of information among people 18 to 29. TV and the internet were the same, dominated everything else. And yet, as I mentioned, on YouTube, you could find things that had an impact on campaigns. I will divert for 1 minute to tell you the story. I was covering the National Rifle Association when Giuliani, then the favorite, was speaking, and he wasn't a big favorite at the NRA because, as mayor of New York, he actually wanted to, stop people from carrying guns into places. So in the middle of the speech, he whips out his cell phone. The cell phone rings. And he opens it up. He's talking to an audience. He says, "Oh, hi, honey, it's my wife." And he goes into this kind of, "Yes, I love you too. Yes, she says hello." A moment that was supposed to endear us to a man who had, after all, had some marital difficulties. So within an hour, up on YouTube, the Romney campaign posts a video of exactly the same thing happening by some coincidence at another Giuliani event a month earlier, thus suggesting this perhaps was not the spontaneous event it looked like. And you saw this throughout. Obama's biggest challenge came courtesy of new media in the sense that the sermons of Reverend Wright were thrown on YouTube, and once again, the same 2 or 3 minutes, or actually in Wright's case, because he had a lot more to say, the same incendiary sermons were cited over and over and over again. Obama's worst moment, when he told a San Francisco audience that white working class folks are bitter and they cling to their guns and their religions, that was recorded, I think, on a cell phone camera or cell phone mic by and sent to the Huffington Post and then accessed by every network. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is what the Obama campaign did with this new media. Now, if you are interested in this, I urge you to read a piece in last June's Atlantic Monthly, which you can find on the web, by Joshua Green, about exactly what Obama did. And I will boil it down in a few seconds. Starting with a group of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs drawn to Obama, they designed a structure based on their own preferences and experiences, abandoning a top-down structure in favor of something we'll call, I don't know, let's come up with a brand new phrase. I know, a web, with multiples of connections that moved horizontally, not vertically. They took the fundraising ability of Howard Dean and married it to the whole new social networking system. They not only realized you could raise enormous sums of money with no transaction costs on the web, right? No postage, no printing, nothing. But then, what did they do? If you sent a contribution to the Obama campaign, that was only the beginning. You were texted, you were emailed, you were told of meetings in your group, you were asked, can you make phone calls? You want to build your own fundraising network. Work enough hours, maybe you'll get to meet the candidate. Maybe you'll get an invitation to the convention. In some of the caucus states, the Obama campaign was there months before, the Obama volunteers were there before the campaign ever got there. And in caucuses, intensity and organization matter. And you cannot overemphasize the importance of this. Not just because it gave Obama $300 million more than McCain by the time the campaign was over. Because, you go to somebody and you ask for 20 bucks, you go back a month later, they'll give you another 20 bucks. Not like a Clinton campaign that maxed out very early. But the organization that I'm talking about then had an impact throughout the country. I went down to North Carolina a week before the election, 15,000 Obama volunteers all over the state, organized to such a degree and so intense that one guy told me that he was in Obama's office making phone calls on when his cell phone rang. And it was somebody asking for a contribution for Obama, and it was the person behind him. That's how in-depth they were. By the way, on Election Day, Obama won North Carolina by 1% of the vote. So this is what we're talking about. That the impact of the new media can be looked at, oh yes, it's interesting, YouTube and the blogs and the webs and MS and Olbermann and O'Reilly, but when you really look at the impact politically, it was what the Obama campaign did with this new stuff that revolutionized everything about political organizing and fundraising. Now, just a few minutes on the general, and then we'll turn to this. I'm staying within the time you gave me because I want to. Okay, I'm going to talk about tone of the coverage, the Sarah Palin story, the debates, and then a couple of wrap-ups. If you trust the Pew Center's findings, Dana talked about this earlier today, and I do, the coverage of John McCain was indeed far more negative. 57% to 14, as opposed to 36% to 29% favorable for Obama. And by the way, whether it was biased or not, the public believed, by a 70 to 9%, the public believed the press wanted Obama to win. So Saturday Night Live skits really had an impact, or something did. But here's the point about this. What was the negative coverage about? Overwhelmingly, it was about the fact that McCain was trailing in the polls. Because most political coverage is, to use the old cliche, horse race coverage. Who's winning? Who's losing? And for almost the entire fall campaign, McCain was behind. And polling now is not done on a daily, weekly, it's done like every 30 minutes. Every organization does polling. And it obsesses the political, it's the crack cocaine of political journalism. It can't get enough of it. So when you say that the McCain coverage was negative, which was, I assume, true, we're not talking about, left-wing journalists saying, what are we going to do to this guy? It's, oh, look, new poll, McCain behind. That's a negative story. And that, more than anything else, explains what had happened. Now, you can find ideology in some of these other studies, content studies. I mean, here's a shock. MSNBC was overwhelmingly favorable to Obama. Fox was slightly more negative. Gee, wow, I never would have thought of that. But you can't make broad judgments about the media coverage based on two more explicitly political cable networks. So when you say that McCain got negative coverage, remember what you're talking about. You're talking about coverage of a losing campaign. Now, Sarah Palin, fascinating case study. And I'm, again, a little not personal, but tell you my reaction. When Sarah Palin was nominated, even before that really effective convention speech, I thought it was a 10 strike. That's a bowling term. I'm sick and tired of football terms and poker terms and politics, so I'm looking for new cliches. It was a 10 strike. It was a 3-cushion shot. It was a grand slam with a finesse. You pick your own. It wasn't just that she excited the conservative base, which she did, or that she was a woman, because Kay Bailey Hutchinson or Meg Whitman would not have gotten nearly that fervor. It was that she perfectly fit an iconic element of American popular culture. The plain-spoken, regular folk, salt-of-the-earth woman, scorned and mocked by the pompous, pinstriped elite. You have seen this again and again. Not sure, I may be making references that are way too early for some of you, but bear with me. The Beverly Hillbillies, Dolly Parton in 9 to 5, Norma Ray, Erin Brockovich, Judy Holliday in the Solid Gold Cadillac, if you really want to go back. Now, it's just that since these are all Hollywood constructs and 99% of Hollywood writers are liberal, these women are all of the left. Well, Sarah Palin was of the populist right. And her, she's fighting back against the elitists who undermine traditional values and mess up our schools and tax our small business folks. Her potential appeal, I thought, was right at the heart of working class folk who for years have bedeviled liberals by voting for Republicans on cultural grounds. And the fact that some of the early coverage of her was scurrilously unfair, she wasn't really pregnant, that baby is really hers, not the daughter's, only made her more sympathetic. So what happened? Well, she was the victim of the same kind of media event that Ted Kennedy suffered from 29 years earlier. Now, this may not sound like a logical thing, so give me a minute here. Back in 1979, Ted Kennedy had decided to run against Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination, way ahead in the polls. He sat down for an interview with Roger Mudd, then a prominent CBS correspondent, and Roger Mudd asked him the following question: "Senator, why do you want to be president?" It produced several moments of near incoherence, widely reported, and marked Kennedy as a very vulnerable candidate. Now, question for you, future journalists or journalist studies or media studies people. Is that a gotcha question? Is that a mugging? It's a softball. It's the kind of question you hope you get asked, unless, of course, you have never sat down and thought, why do I want to be president? Now, that's what happened. What did Katie Couric ask Sarah Palin? I'm not talking about Charles Gibson, because I think the complaint there had merit. You know, Gibson, as somebody wrote, treated her like a kind of a professor treated a not very bright student, you know, little glasses at the end of the nose. You know what the Bush doctrine is? There actually are 5 of them. But here's what Katie Couric asked Sarah Palin. You've said that you have foreign policy experience because Alaska borders Russia. Can you explain that? By the way, when Sarah Palin was nominated, my wife called me and said, you know, Alaska's right next to Russia. And I laughed because it was a ridiculous argument to make, but she made it, Sarah Palin. It is a measure of her answer that when Tina Fey did her famous Sarah Palin impression on Saturday Night Live, most of what she said was what Palin had said verbatim to Katie Couric. Quote, "We have trade missions back and forth. We do. It's very important when you consider even national security issues. The Russia, as Putin rears his head and comes into the airspace of the United States of America, where do they go? It's Alaska. It's just right over the border. It's from Alaska that we send those out to make sure that an eye is being kept on this very powerful nation because they're right there." Or consider another question. Apart from Roe versus Wade, what Supreme Court decisions do you disagree with? For an ardent conservative, how tough is this? Banning school prayer? The whole range of decisions that made it tougher to put criminals away? Eminent domain? And she's a governor of Alaska, right? You know, the court permitted governments to take private property under circumstances most conservatives and a heck of a lot of liberals thought was dangerous. One other question. So what do you read? This is a trap question. So the point about this, again, is that a media-generated event? Is there something complicated about analyzing that? Or is it the fact that someone, a prominent person, is asked a question and cannot answer it? She flunked an easy test, which led to a growing feeling not just that she wasn't ready to be president, but that John McCain, in his first important decision as a nominee, the candidate of experience, had made a very bad judgment. Last point, debates. This is, you're going to have to bear with me, because what does Billy Crystal always say? Don't get me started. I've never been invited, really, to be part of an important debate. I've done a couple of programs, but mostly because I've always threatened to ask math questions of the candidates. You know, let's find something nobody's briefed them on. Train leaves New York going 80 miles an hour. Train leaves Chicago going. And do you think Amtrak should subsidize, you know? So anyway, or who's your favorite Beatle? I think that's a pretty revealing question. Anybody who says Paul, I don't vote for. But here again, you know, these debates go into millions of homes. And in most cases, I think, the candidate's connection with voters matters way more than what the press says. I mean, there are exceptions. When Jerry Ford prematurely liberated Eastern Europe in 1976, the press had to point that out to the public before the public realized that Ford had really made a mistake. But by and large, voters pick up a sense of who they are comfortable with. So let me just show you what I think happened. I have stopped going to debates because you never get a sense of what's really going on. Worst place to watch a debate is in the hall because you aren't seeing what 50 million people are seeing. But the second worst place is in a press room. All these debates take place on college campuses. So you're generally herded into a gym, hundreds of you in long tables watching huge screens. And basically what goes on during these debates is people are gossiping, they're setting up where you're going to go for dinner. Can you believe how stupid my boss is? You come here often. They're not really watching the debate the way most people are. So what I do, I mean, I learned this year in New Hampshire, the last weekend, I was in one of these cavernous barns. And none of us really noticed that Hillary Clinton was connecting with those voters and Obama wasn't. So I stayed back. And I'm watching the kind of first stuff that comes into your computer. And it's all about how Obama's on the defensive, because he's saying, I agree with McCain about some stuff. And there's all this, the Obama people, McCain's beating him up. And the McCain people are already putting on a YouTube showing all the time that Obama's saying, I agree with you. And I'm thinking, I'm on a different planet. What are these people watching? I saw a candidate doing exactly what the theme of the campaign, his campaign had said. I'm tired of old arguments. Let's be reasonable about this. Yeah, John, that's a good idea, but I think I could do it better. He was the civil, respectable candidate. And by the way, if I may be blunt with you folks, if you are a young black guy with a funny name debating a white-haired white man, it's probably not a bad idea to be civil. In case, you're dealing with some primal racial fears, that's not a bad instinctive thing to do. And so the instant polls come out, and suddenly, by 3-1, people are saying, hey, Obama won that debate. And all of a sudden, you watch the press coverage. Well, of course he did, because... So what the debates fundamentally did was to give the public, the electorate, the chance to do what they wanted to do, which is to vote for change. That's a key part of debates when you're in effect the challenger. It's what helped Reagan win a landslide in 1980. It's what helped Clinton win in 92. It's what helped George W. Bush in 2000. The comfort level, which brings us to Election Day, to end. What didn't happen? Did massive new numbers of people go to the polls? No. Turnout was up slightly, from about 60 to 62%. Why? Because a lot of Republicans stayed home. They were disillusioned. They didn't like McCain that much. They thought he was going to lose. Did young people surge to the polls in record numbers? Well, they were 17% of the electorate in 2004, 18% in 2008. But here's what did happen. In 2000, Gore and Bush split the young vote, 18 to 29. 2004, Kerry won by 9 points. 2008, Obama beat McCain by roughly 32 points among young voters. That's almost all of his popular plurality came from that. That's the key, and that's where that new media and all those connections made a difference. What about the Bradley effect? Did white voters tell pollsters one thing and then vote against a guy they didn't want to admit? On Election Day, the Real Clear Politics average of polls had Obama up by about 7.5 points. He won by 7.5 points. Well, did white working class Democrats defect on race? Well, in fact, nationally, as you've heard if you were here earlier, Obama did slightly better among white voters than Kerry and Gore had done, and he won in the same districts where I was hearing real concern on the part of Democrats in Pennsylvania, around Scranton, in Ohio, around suburban Cleveland. In all of those states, Obama won by more than anybody really thought he would. And why? Look, it's a real simple thing. The last 6 weeks of this campaign were dominated by one fear, which unfortunately has proven true, that we were in the worst economic circumstances ever. And under those circumstances, you can take every other issue and just forget about it. So, I'm done. We conclude where we began. The argument I make is that in most elections, this one included, it is usually a mistake to focus on what the media did, on what they performed, if you mean to analyze what happened. Yes, how politicians master the new media is important. Roosevelt with radio, Kennedy and later Reagan with television, Obama with the web. And there are events that can make a difference. But as a general proposition, I think it is incremental. For me, obsessing with day-to-day media coverage is like looking at the ripples on the surface of a river. What's harder to see, and what matters a whole lot more, is the shift in the riverbed. Thank you.
I want to get all of the participants up again. Dana Maestro, Christopher McCauley, Lance Bennett, and Rod Hart. And I want to really take this opportunity to say to Jeff, your talk was so compelling for me. And I really hope you guys are ready to move to the mics that we have for you here so that you can engage. This is going to be a dialogue, and we're going to have a Q&A session that you're all invited to participate in. I want to take a cue from Dean Oliver's discussion and kind of open up this discussion with just a brief framing device. In October, I was in Canada doing a visiting professorship, and I was doing public talks on the Obama campaign and the coverage of that campaign. And I was also watching Canadian media because they were in the throes of their own election. And of course, they could care less about their election. They were all, concerned about the Obama campaign. So one of the newspapers invited me to do an op-ed piece that appeared in the newspaper on Election Day on January 20th. And so I just want to read you the opening comment to the opening paragraph to that op-ed piece, because I can't believe how much it ties into everything that we've been talking about. It also is kind of framing a book that I'm working on about the media coverage and race of Obama. And the title of my book is tentatively called Obama Mia, or Obama Mia. All right? Obama Mia and the Where You At generation mobilize for change they believe in. As I eagerly awaited yesterday's historic inauguration of President Barack Hussein Obama, I reflected upon a few of the most memorable moments of media infamy along the way to this wondrous, magical day. Moments, gentle reader, that still make me want to holler, throw up both my hands. And that, Chris, when you were saying you were, we couldn't say so. Anyway. So to borrow some apt phrasing from the late, great musician Marvin Gaye. In the interest of full disclosure, I confess to being one of those doubters who, up until the end, did not believe America could find the will to even nominate, let alone elect, an African American to this honor and responsibility. But as Jeff pointed out, it was such a bad economy. Of course, anybody would be better than George Bush, right? I still harbored fears that I would awaken to find that it had all been a dream. But then came Election Day 2008, and a genuine feeling of joyful shock and awe that I believe was shared by most of us incredulous 3Bs, Black baby boomers. Emails flooded my inbox, kindly drubbing me about my public pronouncements that, though he were the best man, Mr. Obama would not win. And to all those who emailed me and said, now, what have you to say for yourself, Professor? Because the folks in Canada knew Obama was going to win. And so to those emails, I responded promptly and unequivocally. I have never been so glad to be so wrong. And so with that, I wanted to kind of open up the question by saying that, Jeff, you raised some very important issues, and I want to respectfully disagree with you on one point. As you said, we're going to hold you to some of these statements that you made. One of them was that the reporters for traditional media are left-leaning. For the most part, they all vote Democratic. But you didn't mention the converse is that the owners are mostly Republican and right-leaning. And so there's a sort of fundamental tension in the kind of self-policing that reporters do. Right. And so I wanted to kind of ask you to maybe kind of look at that tension a little bit. Sure. And then there's the other point that I found your discussion about the polling is really rich, because I think the fact that you point out that the media had mainstream media had their eye on the polling and that horse race, and not all these other events that you point out led to the Obama win, particularly the new media. Okay. So my question then to you and the rest of the panelists is, do you think the problem was that the mainstream media, and as you said, we can't really lump them all together, but I'm thinking electronic and print, do you think they were covering the 2004 campaign, whereas the internet and the Where You At generation were clearly remaking electoral political coverage with the blogosphere and those new media? So I want to kind of pose that question to you guys first. But first of all, the Republican-dominated owners, okay. And then.
To me, after 30 years in mainstream media, this notion of owners imposing a kind of limit on the press in terms of political coverage is hooey. The notion, well, let's take an example. NBC is owned by General Electric, does a lot of defense business, I guess. The notion that NBC, and particularly its subsidiary MSNBC, had any coverage reflected by that, you need to find that out. It's an assertion, it's a guess that in my experience is utterly empty. It just doesn't happen that way. Look, when Bill Paley was a big Republican at the time when Dan Rather was covering the Nixon White House. And part of the reason for that, I mean, this may change as our jobs become ever more vulnerable. The idea that if Bill Paley had called up Walter Cronkite and said, hey, you know what, you gotta tell Rather to ease up on Nixon, there would have been a revolt, because that argument ignores the kind of institutional impulses of the press. All I can tell you is I've never seen it. And the point about the political affiliations of the press, I mean, there's just no doubt that any measurement that I can ever seen is they overwhelmingly vote Democratic, but, and this is something that I know conservatives have a hard time believing, that does not mean that reflects how they cover the campaign. Ask Al Gore. It is more than just it's not just a matter of illusion that you can go cover a campaign and divorce yourself from what you want to happen, because what you most don't want to happen is to be wrong. So that, for instance, the first campaign that I covered was Ronald Reagan. Now, I used to work for Robert Kennedy. I don't exactly come out of a Young Americans for Freedom background. But what I thought I saw in that campaign from the get-go was that Ronald Reagan was going to clean Jimmy Carter's clock if he got the chance. And the fact that I did or didn't want that to happen at some level is like the last thing that I think about. I think I was the first correspondent anywhere to suggest that Mike Huckabee might be a factor in this campaign. I'm not a born-again Christian from Little Rock. I just thought he had some chops that were impressive in that campaign. So that's where I go on that. I'm going to stop there because I think other people may want to weigh in or challenge me or say other things. So.
And I also want to welcome the panelists to either ignore that question and then to just ask their own questions of Jeff, or just feel free to jump in. But please, I would love to hear from you guys on this or address something else.
I'll actually follow up on your last question, which is, I agree with almost everything you said, which is extraordinary, and including the relationship between the formation of the Hanseatic League and the discovery of Saran Wrap, which I thought was a particularly insightful analysis, and the carom shots that it took to make John McCain the nominee. But if we buy the premise that in most cases, with the exception of episodic moments, such as the Macaca incident, the press is kind of providing information and not really shaping the outcomes. I would agree with that. But at the same time, that's no longer the only media game going. As you point out, that social media, participatory media, social networking is really becoming, especially for young voters, who I think you can make a case, decided the election because of the swing that you pointed out from 2004 to 2008 that went to the Democrats. Huge swing. And this is their game. This is the social media generation. And so we really have two media systems that are intertwined, I mean, increasingly intertwined, and yet the younger voters are disconnecting from the mainstream media and connecting and participating in the social media system. So I think that has to be credited in terms of media making a tremendous difference.
I think I not only don't disagree with that, I heartily affirm it. I had the experience here, if I may be local, get the local angle. This actually happened here, my last class of about 150 or 200 people. Just as a matter of curiosity, I said, I knew I was kind of leaving cable for the old media broadcast. I said, how many of you watch one of the evening newscasts? All right, 3 people raised their hands. And then a couple of months later in Chicago, I was asking an audience of somewhat more seasoned people, how many of you have accessed YouTube? And they thought I was talking about like a hemorrhoid remedy. And so what you're describing is true. There is this kind of gap. And the Republicans are now, what the Republicans are really worried about is, they dominated and still dominate talk radio. And that was a big impact in the 90s. Well, this new media is, both the web and social networking, is dominated by liberals and the left. And and here's why CBS values me so much. I figured out that younger people are going to be around a lot longer than older people. And if their voting habits stay as democratic as they are, the Republican Party has a challenge. So this is absolutely right. The only other thing worth saying is the other thing that is important to note about the Obama victory, which was, kind of in the middle. It was a solid victory. It wasn't a landslide, is that he won or tied in virtually all age groups. In however you slice it demographically, even in traditional ways, he still performed pretty damn well. He won the Catholic vote, which John Kerry had lost. He got 67% of the Hispanic vote. The 04 exit polls are wrong. Do not believe that Bush got 43%. There's been a study of that. But he got about 39, 40. He didn't, McCain did much worse. But I think the key to understanding what happened in terms of where that plurality came from was overwhelmingly among young people, partly because of social networking, partly because Obama was their guy. I mean, you can't ignore this, and I just didn't want the speech to go on forever. I mean, the fact, Obama, look, allow me to say something which could get me in trouble.
Go for it.
Okay. It is not unknown that white kids think it's cool to be black. You've got too many suburbanites walking around with caps on backwards, calling each other dog and bro. It's not an impressive thing for this old Caucasian. But Obama wasn't cool because he was black. Obama was cool because he was cool. Everything about him, the effect, the fact that he talked reasonably, the fact that he was the Harvard Law Review president who could get up and kind of do the, brush the dust off his shoulders. The fact that he, like a lot of young people, is relatively comfortable talking about race in ways that older people would find, he was asked once about another candidate about whether he thought he was, he had black chops, and Obama said, "I got to see him dance."
That was about Clinton.
Yeah, right, Clinton.
Right.
I got to see him dance first. Now, that's not a guy who's afraid of kind of playing, of being loose enough about this stuff to say, we can go a little beyond that. So that's too long-winded, but I couldn't agree more. And if you want to see people who are really worried about this stuff, the Republicans, both in terms of their lack of ability at the social networking and the young ones.
So could you elaborate just a little bit more about the Republicans? So first of all, who do they have who's cool? And secondly,
Michael Steele. No.
Secondly, how are they going to use social media? Because that's all they're talking about right now. Is we've got to get in the social media game. How are they going to do it?
Well, this obsession with trying to figure this out, they're still cleaning up from the inaugural. And I've always said that for me, a lot of my colleagues are like kids in the back seat of a car on a vacation. You're pulling out of the driveway and they're yelling, "Are we there yet?" So I don't know that. But look, if you really, from a purely political spectrum, it doesn't answer your question. The Republicans are going to do great if Obama's economic plans don't work. And by the way, if that happens, that's going to have about as much to do with race as the return of Haley's Comet. It ain't going to be, nobody's going to say, you see what proves they can't do it. It's not like the first black manager. I mean, if this economy collapses, that's going to take care of the Democrats. And if it doesn't, they're going to be in power for a long time. Well, I think there's two issues about that. It's because it's not the mechanics that's going to do it. The reason why Obama's social networking worked was in part because his people, who was the co-founder of Facebook? I can't even remember his name, who worked for the Obama campaign. They knew this stuff, but it took the candidate to do it.
And I'd like to...
There's no other candidate that would have been able, if John Edwards had all these people working for him, I don't think he would have pulled this off. Or for that matter, Hillary Clinton. It took, the reason why those entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley were so drawn to Obama was that he spoke their language, the community organizer, the horizontal networking. That's how they made their money. And so there was the fit of the man in the moment was unusual. So I don't know how the Republicans are going to do it.
Just a short observation. My observation this year was that, and I've never quite seen this happen in my years of teaching, the Republican kids on campus, it was sad. I felt sad for them. Man, it wasn't about ideology. It was really about cultural style. And so much about Obama was exactly what they want to be. Really smart, really agile, thoughtful, conversational, eloquent. And they knew that their guy, was, that angry old man. And they were, you talk to them in groups and stuff, and they were just kind of frozen in time. And it was really the conflation of cultural style and political ideology.
Yeah,
To which I'd only add this. I did a piece for Slate magazine in the early part of this, in which the theme of it was this. if you look at a campaign and want to try to figure out who's likely to win, remember this rule. Bugs Bunny always beats Daffy Duck. By which I mean, if you know your Warner Brothers, Chuck Jones great cartoons, Bugs is Cary Grant. Bugs is like laid back like this. He's cool. He never gets ruffled. When somebody really ticks him off, he will say to him, a la Groucho Marx, "Of course you realize this means war." Whereas Daffy is, "Thanks for the sour persimmons, cousins." He's like ready to blow up. Now ask yourself in this campaign, who was Bugs Bunny? Who was Daffy? In fact, by the end of the campaign, it's actually your point. John McCain had now morphed into Yosemite Sam. With the guns. That one. So that's part of what I think it all fits in, that it wasn't style alone, and it wasn't cool alone. It was that combination of cognitive intelligence and emotional intelligence that is unique. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Clinton take, he's not ready. In a normal year, that would have been effective, probably. This year, people were ready to change, and Obama embodied a lot of it.
Chris, please.
I just wanted to say something about Obama's style, and I guess I'll take a slight issue with Jeff on this, talking about his appeal to certain white students or to young whites. To me, and I saw this here when he came and spoke at City College, that, and it's something that we actually saw him do, I think, throughout his campaigning. I especially saw him do it in the South. And that is, Obama has this tremendous ability to change his style of speech to actually to appeal to a certain audience. I mean, a number of people had noticed that when he was in the South, I mean, he sounded like a Baptist preacher, right? I mean, we didn't even know he had that in him, right? All of a sudden, he went down south, and he's getting into the cadence, and he's doing church, right? When I saw him speak on the lawn there at City College, there are various points where he would break into, almost like a sort of city slang at various points. So I think that one of the things that he was able to do was to use a variety of ways of speaking that he tailored to individual audiences, or to at least to some audiences. And I think that it really worked. Weber would call this, he has charisma, and it's sometimes really hard to go up against charisma.
And indeed, it was one of the big problems that the late night comedians had. Most of the time, the whole trick about a late night comedian, I mean the talk show guys, is you have to find, when they do political humor, you're talking to not necessarily the most plugged in audience. I don't mean Stewart, God knows, or Colbert, but the Leno, Letterman, O'Brien, that group. So you find a trait, usually, negative preferably, and that's your joke. So Bob Dole is old. Al Gore is boring. George W. Bush is dumb. We don't even have to get into the Bill Clinton thing. The horn dog, that's the joke. It was really hard, and to some extent still is. I mean, to figure out what's the joke. I mean, Obama now, there's plenty of stuff to make fun of him now. None of his cabinet nominees have remembered to pay their taxes. That's a good political joke. But as a stylistic matter, what are you going after here? What's the? Now, unfortunately, most presidents sooner or later present their flaws to us in unmistakable terms. But it was tough, and it's an interesting question as to whether or not, when you talk about the press being in the tank, whether they're in the tank or whether on personal grounds. I'm not talking about his politics, because there's plenty of stuff you can argue back and forth, left and right. All right, so I'll just give you one example from current now. We have this big notion of Rush Limbaugh being encouraged, Democrats encouraging the country to think of him as the leader of the Republican Party. A former Bush speechwriter, David Frum, did a piece and said, let's see how this matches up. We have a reasonable, civil, highly eloquent, highly intelligent, physically fit, model husband and father, whose one sin is maybe he smokes a cigarette. On the other side, you've got this morbidly obese, thrice divorced, ranting and raving drug addict. How unhappy do you think the Democrats are? Why do you think they're working so hard to make that the match? And notice this, we're not talking about ideas here. We're talking about something else. I think to make a long-winded answer or agreement short, I don't think we disagree because, first of all, did you notice when Hillary Clinton was campaigning in rural and southern places, she sometimes talked a little bit more like a southern, we got that Arkansas accent right out of Chicago?
Entirely.
Yeah. This is not uncommon.
So Dana, I would like for you to kind of weigh in here. And
I felt welcome to weigh in, but let's see. Well, I actually did have one question about, you had suggested that Obama emphasized the funny name and, anyone who named him would have never suggested that if they thought he was going to run for president, to demonstrate that he was a change candidate. And sure. And in fact, I actually thought he did that much more strategically to demonstrate that he wasn't change, and in fact, he was very much like the other, the white people who might be trying to vote for him, because he was trying to undercut the argument that, Hussein, that's a scary name, and et cetera. So I actually had a very different take on why he was trying to normalize this in the media and suggest it often so it was now familiar.
I think he was just doing the best he could with a name that made people uncomfortable. I mean, what are you going to do? He could, it's his name. He used to be, in Columbia, he was Barry Obama. And that's part of that journey he recounts in his first book. He said, no, I'm Barack. So this is a case where if you're given a lemon, you make lemonade. You can either be defensive about it, you can ignore it, or you can just, this is the Al Smith dinner where you're supposed to be funny.
Right.
So I needed to put that in context. So what are you going to do? You're going to make a joke that everybody gets. Look, there are so many parts about this that I thought were a sign that stuff has changed. I mean, if you're worried about primal stereotypes, do you really play a lot of basketball? Yeah, because he's a basketball player. It was like, what is it? People going to make a fuss about that? I mean, that's just. So he's a lousy bowler, which one could expect, culturally, and he's a fine basketball player. In fact, he made a 3-point shot when he was playing with the troops in, Kuwait or Iraq. It's like he was saying, people, I think, cool it. It's okay. You might
So
notice
Jeff,
remember that time he got in a little trouble where he said, which I thought was a perfectly reasonable statement, I don't look like most people who run for president.
Right.
By the way, one of the things about Obama that I may have been the only person to raise, he's from a big city.
right. And Jeff, let me,
Could I just make that?
yeah,
Do you
no,
know
please.
how much Americans don't like their presidents to be from big cities? Because the city from Thomas Jefferson on has been the place of pestilence and the old Europe. And America was farms, and America was yeomen, and America's was, nobody's from the big city. Even people from the big cities aren't from big cities. John Kennedy was from, the Cape. And John Kerry, you wouldn't know he had a $10 million townhouse on Beacon Hill. Obama, he's from Chicago. He was a community organizer. It may not be quite the historical significance of the first African-American president, but that's an interesting other stereotype that he managed to say, you know what? This is where I'm from. What are you going to do about it?
Jeff, I just want to get something in here about this issue around civility, and particularly in comparison to McCain's personality. Because one of the things that I think many of us felt is that Obama did not have the option to ever get angry the way that McCain gets angry. In fact, in some ways, you kind of wonder if he chose Rahm Emanuel to be able to get out some of that anger that he can't express. But that was really one of the things, because I don't think many of us in this room has seen it, but one of the things that we've certainly heard about is McCain's inordinate temper.
Some of us have been personally experiencing it.
Okay. So, and
yes. It's true.
And I bring this up because...
You heard him.
Oh, okay. I bring this up because one of the things that you said brought this to mind, and I kind of wanted to ask both you, the panel, and also people in the room how they felt about, or how they feel about this. Because on this issue of how it is that Obama was allowed to be, I mean, I'm assuming, based on what it is that we've seen, that he does not have much of a temper, right?
When he put his staff together, he said one thing to them: no drama. It was the least, nobody could believe this was going to happen for the whole campaign. I've never seen a staff like this. And it comes, remember when Mike Dukakis said the fish stinks from the head? Well, the fish smells good from the head, too. The Clinton campaign was like, I don't know what it was like the Jerry Springer show. People literally yelling in the most concrete Anglo-Saxon terms what they should do to each other. Fights that broke out on a daily basis, the campaign manager running into her office and crying, the chief strategist. It was, and leaking to the press, by the way. The Obama campaign, there wasn't one, not when they lost New Hampshire, not when they ran into trouble with Reverend Wright. And one of the things that persuaded a lot of conservatives to back Obama, something they are now regretting given his financial policies, was that this guy seemed to have presidential temperament. So whether, the fact that he may not have been allowed to be angry, I don't think it would have occurred to him.
And I need to, actually, I do want to sort of get the participatory culture aspect going.
I'm
and
sorry, let me
invite
just
some people
make
who
one
have
last
questions.
comment, Anna?
Okay, so while people are coming up,
Okay.
make it short.
No, because the thing was this. I was wondering if, in fact, Obama at any point could have complained about racism in much the same way that Hillary had raised issues around sexism and how it is that she was being treated. Because for me, and I think many of us felt, that would have been political suicide if he had raised it in much the same way that she did.
Yeah, some people in Canada said also that there was a reverse Bradley moment, and it also had to do with that race thing. But please, sir, can you maybe just say your name if you want, and then just...
Joel Einhorn. Getting back to the media's effect, if it's a given, let's say, that the media was quite objective in covering the campaign, what do you think about the background for the campaign, namely the way the media covered all the other events in the world that were going on that may have enabled Obama to win?
That's a good question. And I'm going to throw it back to you because I'm not sure I'm right about this. One thing about media coverage in general, not just about campaigns, is it tends to be cumulative, and it tends to be like, is it Newton's first law or second law? I flunked science. The body at motion continues in motion. Gene McCarthy once said, nastily, as is typical of him, but accurately, that the press is like blackbirds. One flies on the telephone pole, blackbird. The other, all the others. One flies away, they all fly away. So that by the time you got to the campaign, the narrative story of what was going on in Iraq and what was going on in the economy and what was going on in the Bush administration was negative. But now I throw the question back to you. Did that create the reality, or were they reflecting the fact that the war in Iraq was going badly, I mean, whatever you thought of the original decision, just based operationally, that in 2006, all of the corruption stories were about Republicans and their abuse of power, and that the middle class in America had actually lost ground since 2001. If you believe that that was as I tend to do, that was basically the press reporting, that's what happened, with the one exception. I think the press was very slow to pick up the fact that, in fact, Petraeus' strategy in Iraq was bearing fruit, because they were so used to the narrative of a failed Iraq war, they couldn't look at anything and say, well, that's getting better. The Times, actually, the New York Times, which every conservative hates, was actually an exception of this. But by and large, I do think you'd have to answer on your own terms whether you think that was a portrait painted by the press or a reflection of the fact that things had gone very bad. And the only thing I can say to that was, by 2007, many Republicans were really, really unhappy with what had gone on. That's the best I can do. Great panel. And earlier in the previous panel, it was said that the media are parasitic. That is to say that there is investigative reporting that takes place,
and that the other media use that information that the investigative reporting has been able to research and to bring to the public's attention. And Jeff, you were saying that this was the first election where the web really came into full flower. My question is, the Los Angeles Times, I believe 2 years ago, had 1,200 on its editorial staff. Today it has 600. The Rocky Mountain News, a 150-year-old newspaper, recently shut shop. We're looking at really the death of newspapers, which means also a mass extermination of the trained, professional, investigative journalists who are responsible for much of this media coverage. And so my question to the panel is, what does this mean in 4 years when we're talking about, if we have this conference again, and we're talking about a presidential election, if we have 1/10 the number of operating newspapers and investigative reporters?
You
Yeah,
raised the
please.
question that everybody is asking, and the debate is now as to whether new forms will emerge or whether, in fact, there will be a dearth. If you want to be encouraged, I can point you to some websites that do real investigative reporting. On the left, broadly speaking, TalkingPointsMemo.com, the Josh Michael Marshall website, who actually broke the story of the Department of Justice firings. Pajamas Media, or actually Little Green Footballs, in 2004 broke the story that the Dan Rather report about George Bush was fatally flawed. That said, whether you're going to have, what happens when we no longer have two reporters who will put on a story for 4 months to dredge up some account of wrongdoing, whether there'll be an alternative, whether there will be foundation-based reporting, everybody in my business is in the midst of a lot of serious debate because we don't know the answer to that. But it's a real big deal.
And can I get the student to ask at least one question, and then we can have the other panelists address that, and then we'll have to wrap it up. I'm sorry.
No, come on up here. Come.
There you go.
Yes, Mr. Greenfield, my understanding is that your argument that Obama's success in this last election was not a result so much of the media, but rather an achievement of a highly organized series of political tactics used by his administration to make the, quote, crucial shift in the campaign. To clarify, does your argument undermine Obama's outstanding credentials to be the president of this country?
No, it doesn't. Because, as I think I just mentioned, all the organizing in the world wouldn't work if you did the candidate himself and someday herself didn't have the chops. Remember, Obama's credentials, measured by traditional politics, would have rendered him out of the running. You can't be a state legislature for 9 years, a senator for a year and a half, suddenly decide you want to run for president, and say, here I am. In this case, the credentials that Obama had were communications credentials, I think cerebral credentials, the ability to think through problems, and the ability to perfectly encapsulate the moment that, if I can use this overused phrase, the national mood. He fit it. So no, without the fundamental qualities, I don't care who your ad guy is, and I don't care who your pollster is, and I don't care who's running your social networks. It's not going to work. So I think no.
And if any of the last panelists want to make a last word that's short and, keep it short and sweet, we can please say your last comment, and then we'll wrap it up.
We've been doing some analysis of micro patterns in Obama's language. And one of the facts that we've uncovered is that his embellishment scores are the lowest of any candidate since 1948. And what that is adjectives and adverbs divided by verbs and nouns. This is a guy who spoke in a staccato way, never laid heavy emphasis on poetry or the rest. It was a kind of a clear-cut, concrete, realistic style, and not something he could cognitively control, but that language was perfectly suited to the times we're in, and I think to the candidate himself.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Thank the panelists for this fabulous discussion.